again, talking about David and Goliath. My oldest son, Marilyn, my oldest son's name is David. And I have one of those man bags with got all the stuff in it that I don't unload, because if I never unload it, I'll always have what I need. And I haul that back and forth for me week by week from Washington back to Iowa or wherever else I happen to be. And in that is one of a smooth stone that was picked up in the stream where David picked up 5 smooth stones before he slew Goliath. And I carry that with me wherever I go on my travels to remind me that we are going up against a heavy enemy of the United States. These are the constitutional demolition crew. Now I look across, I serve on the House Judiciary Committee, and I've been there now, this is my 10th year. I'm the non-lawyer on the Judiciary Committee, and I think it gives me an unfair advantage to those people that were educated at Harvard, because they're always wrapped up in this idea of having to argue both sides of the issue before they decide which side they're going to have to defend. They're pretty creative. And for me, I just have to argue the right side, the constitutional side of the issue. But another little piece that I would pass out here is, in my pocket is this acorn. And I've carried an acorn in my pocket now for, I suppose about 2.5 or 3 years, every day. And I do that because I'm reminded of what Acorn tried to do to the Constitution and to the legitimate elections that we have, and maybe had, and maybe still have in this country. But this was one of these things going up against Goliath. Acorn was Goliath. And I had a researcher working with me. We drilled down into Acorn. I went to some of their places around the country. I've had my picture taken at their national headquarters down in New Orleans long before anybody paid attention nationally to the news at Acorn. And I went up, stood up to that door and held onto those bars and had my picture taken, because that was a symbolic act of what we needed to do to drill into Acorn. Well, we drilled down into them. We got some information on them. I was confident I was right, but I didn't have time to sell the idea to the rest of the House of Representatives. So I brought the First Amendment to defund Acorn about 2.5 years before they hit the national news. But it wasn't enough. It's not enough to be right. It's not enough to be, as General Petraeus says, that you need to be there first with the truth. That's important and it's an essential, but it's not enough. You've got to get the message out. You've got to get the media to pick it up. You've got to get people to pay attention. It isn't good enough just to go down to the floor and say we need to eliminate all funding to Acorn. I did that. And I lost on that vote. And there were only about 17 or 18 that would vote with me on that day. But when Hannah Giles and James O'Keefe went into those Acorn centers around the country, and one posed as a pimp, the other as a prostitute, and we saw before our eyes how abhorrent that policy was at Acorn headquarters, the revulsion got so great in America that the House and the Senate abolished all funding to Acorn. And today, in our appropriations bills, it's a standard language in there that says no funds shall go to Acorn, their affiliates, or their subsidiaries. That's in law today because of a couple of intrepid reporters that had the courage to step forward and take on Goliath. Around that same period of time, we had a congressman from West Virginia, his name was, well, still is, Alan Mollahan. He was a second-generation congressman from West Virginia, and there was a long history of the corruption in that family. I received a tip from an individual who was the mayor of a little town in West Virginia, and he said, you need to look into the corruption of Alan Mollahan. And so I did. And I have an investigator that I've worked with, and he's anonymous and works behind the scenes. And he drilled down into that trail, and we ended up with a 500-page report on how Alan Mollahan went from $150,000 in net worth to 2 years later being worth $6.5 million on a congressman's salary. And I went down to the floor of the House of Representatives, and Nancy Pelosi had named him the chairman of the Justice Appropriations Committee. Now, we put that 500-page report on the Attorney General's desk and said, investigate Alan Mollahan. Well, he's there controlling, swinging the gavel and controlling the purse strings of the people that are investigating him. And so I wrote an amendment, and you have to make it so that it's in order. A lot of you know this. Teresa knows this, Bill, Rob, a lot of you do. I had to write the amendment so it was in order, so we did this. I brought an amendment to Justice Appropriations, and he had said that he is an innocent man with integrity, and that it was just simply a witch hunt. So I brought an amendment that would strike $1 million out of the Justice Appropriations and put $1 million back in. Then what you do is you speak to the reason for that and the purpose of that money. I stepped down on the floor, and he's up on in the podium, halfway up in the seats of the houses, you know, where they manage a bill. I stepped down there right in front of him, and I said, "This $1 million is to come out of the appropriations, and it's to go back in, and the purpose is to clear the good name of the chairman of the Justice Appropriations Committee that's right ahead of me." And he had no idea that was coming, and you could see his hands trembling on the podium, and all he could say was, "Ad hominem attack, ad hominem attack." Well, it wasn't. It was 500 pages of facts. How he was corrupt, and he was using your money to enrich himself. And he and one of his corrupt buddies actually bought a farm together on, to get this, Cheat River in West Virginia. And they didn't have any embarrassment about it, and we couldn't beat him. But what happened was, a Democrat challenged him in the primary because of his corruption that we'd exposed. The Democrat beat him, and we beat the Democrat. Now we've got a Republican sitting in that seat today. There are a lot of places to take on the other side. Well, I'm going to tell you also, in that Judiciary Committee, the most polarized committee on the Hill, they got me to a point one day where I said to all the Democrats, "You're all a bunch of Marxists." And I looked, they were not even offended. That tells you how bad it is. Or the left-wing blogs had a video out there, and one of those left-wing MSNBC fellas, I don't remember their names now, but I do that once in a while, just go into their camp. And he ran a video, and he complained because I had a constituent down in Red Oak, Iowa. He didn't know where it was, but I remember it. The constituent stepped up and he said, "Barack Obama is a Muslim and a Marxist." And I was being attacked because I didn't defend the president's religion. Well, his religion is what it is. He said he's a Christian. I accept him for that. I can't find out what's in anybody. I don't know what's in anybody's heart. But what was curious was that my response to that individual was, "Well, he's at least a Marxist." And that didn't offend anybody on the other side either. So you know what we're up against. These people are, at least, they are the ideological equals of the people that Simon's been talking about. They are driving this country off the cliff, into the left, into the abyss of socialism. Our individual freedom is under attack every day. We have a president that understands, I think, what he's doing. Either that or he has people that are pushing him that understand what they're doing. And you should remember that Lenin has said that there were only about 100 people in Russia that knew what was going on in the Bolshevik Revolution. The rest were useful idiots. They don't have to know what's going on. They just know knee-jerk who they're going to follow, who they're going to listen to. And if you wonder how that message goes out across the country when one person speaks and they all jump on and advocate for that position and stand say the president's position, they're not thinking it through. They just instinctively know who they support and then they defend their position. These are not rational people, in my mind. And serving there on the Immigration Subcommittee, constantly railed on Zoe Lofgren, the former chair of that committee, because she would bring individuals forward before the committee, and there are tragic stories in every walk of life. You know some of them. I know a fair amount of them by now. She would always bring those people forward to tell their story, and then wanted to rewrite immigration law in the country so that no individual ever had a tragic story again. You can just keep adapting law over and over again as tragic stories come forward. And so I would say, where is your reason? Where is your empirical data? Where's your study? I want to know what the data is. The tragic stories are not enough for us to move all national policy, so I constantly railed on them, where are your studies? And I would introduce study after study regularly all along the way. And one day, she called the committee to order and she said, "I ask unanimous consent. Congressman King has been demanding that we introduce studies. And I have a study and I ask unanimous consent to introduce it into the record." Well, with triumph, she introduced this study into the record. And I couldn't wait to get my hands on it. And I got that study, picked it up and looked at it. It wasn't a study. It was a critique of a study that I had introduced several months earlier. That's what substitutes for reason, data, and rational thought. And it's a pretty typical example of what's going on the other side. We should be very concerned about people that are in control of our policy. They can't think any better than that. Think about how Western civilization was established. This age of reason. Where did it come from? Well, first I would tell you that the Greeks picked it up from Mosaic law. And they were razzed a little bit for that within the culture. But the foundation of the rule of law actually came from Mosaic law, flowed through the Greeks, was established a little more strongly within Roman law, and found its way into Western Europe and Western civilization because of the Irish scribes. I have to tell you, the Irish did save the world. But that's a separate lecture. In any case, so you have that foundation of the age of reason in Greece. Now imagine Socrates sitting there, and I actually have a stone that I picked up in front of his cave here a while back, and I keep that at home. That matters too. These little talismans cause me to think about the anchors of how we got where we are. But I can imagine Socrates sitting there in the marketplace, and these young philosophers would come up like young gunslingers, challenging the fastest gun in the West, the wisest man in the foundation of Western civilization, Socrates, and they would try their theorems and their axioms on Socrates, and he would ask a series of questions and shoot them down. Well, but they were proud. They were proud of developing the ability to reason, and from it came the foundation of rational thought that is our science. The culture, the Greek culture, at least the philosophical component of the Greek culture, embraced the ability to reason. It was part of who they were. It was a culture that took pride in being able to develop their intellectual thought and seek out answers, a culture of curiosity. Now I come to this world today, and I could take you down through the different components of how we got to Western civilization. Of course, the foundation of Christianity. Martin Luther was another piece of this. The Age of Enlightenment, the English-speaking component of it, not the non-English-speaking side of that. They didn't contribute very much except utopianism and socialism. But the English-speaking part of the Age of Enlightenment contributed a lot. Free enterprise and Adam Smith. And the Enlightenment from the Scottish Enlightenment that came forward. But all of those pieces that give us the foundation of the way we think and who we are, that are tied together over 2,000 plus years of history, are being eroded today by the leftists who are losing their ability to reason. That age of reason can't be translated into this modern era. How bad can it be? We lost the ability to do that during the Dark Ages, and it had to be reconstructed. And if it wasn't for the records that came forward, actually from the Roman Church as well as the Irish scribes, that re-educated Western Europe and the Middle Ages and the dawn of the Middle Ages, we wouldn't be a civilization today. How do you think about how do you live if you can't reason, if you can't think, if you can't support rational thought, if you can't educate scientists that can use this modern technology that always improves our quality and standard of living? What happens? They are degrading America's potential by eroding the ability to reason within this culture and civilization, and they're undermining God-given liberty at the same time. That's what we're up against, ladies and gentlemen, and that's what we have to fight against. And free enterprise capitalism is a gift to us, and it brings out the best in us. And we need to be in the business of expanding America's gross domestic product, and that means increase the average annual productivity of each of us. In doing so, we increase the average annual GDP. And when we do that, everybody's standard of living goes up. And the idea that somehow we can pay some people not to work and then bring people into America to do work that Americans won't do. I'll give you some data. This is Stuart Varney, another good Brit that came over here to the United States. And I've been saying this for quite some time, 7 or 8 months, and even my own staff was a little nervous about the data. But I'd sit up at night, can't sleep, go on internet rabbit trails, and go to the Department of Labor. In there, I added up the age categories of those who were simply not in the workforce. And you add to that the list of those that are unemployed, around 13 million. Then you can, so I started at 16, and there are about 9.7 million people between 16 and 19 simply not in the workforce. They might be students, they're probably not early retirees, but they're not working. And then you go from 20 to 25, and you start adding up the age groups. I took it up to 74 because Walmart hires at 74, we pay unemployment at 74. They are a good company. And so I added up all those folks, and then I added to that the numbers of the unemployed list. We have a number that meets or exceeds 100 million people of working age in America that are simply not in the workforce. 100 million. And so 1 out of every 3 people you meet on the street, presuming they're working age people, if they're under 16, they're not in that category. If they're 75 or up, they're not in that category, are not working. And we are bringing into this country about 1.2 million people every year. And before the economic downward spiral in 2008, we had legal immigration was taking up all of the new jobs created by the economy. And while that's going on, we get into 2nd and 3rd generation welfare families. Now, I remember an article written in the Des Moines Register some years ago, 10 or more years ago, actually. They had gone into the city of Milwaukee and done an interview in each of the households in 36 square blocks. 6 blocks by 6 blocks. And this was all a residential area. These were people that had moved up from Milwaukee for the brewery jobs in the early 30s when Prohibition was over. And so they were an African-American community. In 36 square blocks, they did not find, and they certified there wasn't a single male employed head of household in all of those homes in 36 square blocks. What had happened? They had moved to Milwaukee for the jobs, and the jobs left because of automation and competition. And the lament in the paper was that we couldn't bring jobs to the people in Milwaukee. And I read it and I thought, well, how did they get here? They came for the jobs. And people don't migrate for work anymore because we have a welfare system that freezes them in place. We marked up the Farm Bill last week. Frank Lucas from Oklahoma is the chairman of the committee. I want to synthesize what he said, but as the Democrats from California were railing away against the cuts in nutrition, which we took $16 billion out of the food stamp component of this. Those numbers, by the way, Tom Vilsack says that for every dollar in food stamps you hand out, you get $1.84 in economic activity. So it's a good economic stimulator. I hope he doesn't run for president someday. He'll have to answer to that. But the Democrats in California were defending that, and Okie Frank Lucas made a statement that boiled down to me of this, that he understood that if they had the food stamp program and the welfare program that we have today, back in the 30s when the Dust Bowl hit and the Okies went out there under John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath narrative, that they would have never gone to California then. If we'd had that kind of a program, they wouldn't have gone where the jobs are. We would have had an enclave in Oklahoma left over from the systems. We have 72 different means-tested federal welfare programs in the United States. And the President, with utter audacity and contempt for the rule of law and the Constitution, with the stroke of his pen, wiped out the welfare to work that passed in '96. Signed by Bill Clinton, I might add. Simon added that dialogue. This President has great disrespect, and I will say contempt, for the Constitution. He was a constitutional law professor. He was an adjunct professor at the University of Chicago. He taught there. While my former chief of staff, who many of you know, Brenna Finley, went to law school at Chicago. And Brenna's now general counsel for Governor Branstad. But she was wise enough not to take constitutional law from him, just to argue with him in the hallway. And I admire that about Brenna, but I had a meeting one night at a Federalist Society. I had 7 graduates of Chicago School of Law that had taken constitutional law from Barack Obama. And they stood there and told me narrative after narrative how they tried to define the Constitution as meaning what it says. And he, as their professor, would every time revert it back to the liberal activist version. This Constitution doesn't mean to Barack Obama what it says. He's taken an oath to uphold it, and he's shown utter contempt for it. One of the things that he did that I'm very disappointed that the United States Senate didn't defend their constitutional authority. The Senate was coming into pro forma sessions to prevent the President from making certain appointments to boards that he could only do as recess appointments. President Obama made those recess appointments, even though the Senate was not in recess. They were gaveling in every day. And so the President of the United States, with utter audacity, declared the Senate to not be in session when they were in session. And that means if the President can declare the Senate to not be in session when they're in session, he can abolish any effectiveness of the United States Senate. And the Senate made some noise for 2 or 3 days, and then apparently has walked away and left that meeting. Our founding fathers envisioned that each branch of government would jealously guard and protect the power and authority granted to it within each article in the Constitution. Legislature is Article 1. We do the legislature. Article 2 is the executive branch. And the President and other executive officers are bound by oath to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The President has shown contempt for the laws. And even to this extent, first, the prelude to this is John Morton, the head of ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, signed out 3 memos here some months ago that directed his ICE enforcement officers to essentially disregard the law and selectively banned enforcing a law against immigrants who were not a threat. Those who had committed serious crimes or felonies or multiple serious misdemeanors. I didn't say a lot about that. because the executive branch has to have prosecutorial discretion. Then it becomes a judgment call on whether you enforce it or whether you don't. Well, I think that there were many times that the law should have been enforced when it wasn't going to be, but then the president crossed the line. Several months later, now I brought an amendment to block any funding to implement or enforce those board memos, and that passed the House in the appropriations bill a few weeks ago. But a month ago, just about today, Barack Obama stepped out into the Rose Garden, and he announced that they had a new policy. And this was by executive edict, I would call it. This new policy is this. He created 4 new classes of people. This is the DREAM Act Light, as some will call it. These 4 new classes of people were people who presumably came into the United States before they were 16, that are not yet 30, that are either in school or graduated from high school or received a GED or have been honorably discharged from the military. That's the 4 classes. And he also directed U.S. Citizenship Immigration Services to create a work permit. A work permit that was created out of thin air. Congress has created all of the visas. Everything that's there that you have that brings people into this country and gives them a condition to work, that's all designed and written by Congress. It's all law. And I've got a whole list of these visas in my BlackBerry right next to my invitation list for the president. But when the president ordered USCIS to create a work permit out of thin air, and when he directed them not to enforce the law on whole classes of people, constitutionally, in my view, out the window went prosecutorial discretion. It is an unconstitutional violation. He has crossed the line. And I will take you back to the narrative of about 1999, when I was in the State Senate at the time, and Bill in the House, and I received a fax copy of the Washington Blade in my fax machine at home. I never was able to read the return on that to see who sent that to me. But that's a newspaper in Washington, D.C. that caters to folks of different preferences, I should say. And it had said there that Governor Vilsack had issued an executive order to grant special protected status for sexual orientation and gender identity. And I looked that up in the Iowa Administrative Bulletin, and on page 632, they had buried this executive order number 7. So my light bulb went on, and smoke started to come out of my ears. I contacted our Republican lawyers on the staff side of the Iowa Senate, and they came back and said, well, it really is a constitutional executive order. It's nuanced in such a way that you'd have to be a lawyer to understand that. So, in other words, Steve, you don't understand. Well, I sat down and I set it up in a word processor with strike-throughs and underlines so I could read what it actually did. And it was pretty clear to me that Governor Vilsack had rewritten the civil rights section of the Code of Iowa by executive order. I'm not going to tolerate that. I took an oath to uphold the Constitution, and I jealously want to guard the power within the branch of government that I'm especially serving. And so that was this fax copy came on Wednesday night. On Thursday, I got this negative news from our lawyers, and I sent out my opinion to about a dozen people. And then Friday morning, about 10:30, was driving down along out on the highway and out in the country, listening to WHO radio, and I heard Jan Michelson talking about this executive order. And his description sounded curiously like what I had written the night before. And I've never asked this. I don't know where it came from. But I pulled off on the gravel and dialed up Jan Michelson and told him that I believe it's a constitutional violation. And he said, what are you going to do about it, Senator? And, I'm 50,000 watts. It's a pretty good voice, that animal. And I said, well, I'm suing the governor. And Jan said, well, do you have the support of the legislature? No, I don't, buddy. And I said, well, there are 150 of us. If 149 of them think it's a bad idea, I'm suing him anyway. I don't need the legislature to sue the governor. And so it's kind of good that you give your word out there and then you can keep it. For example, if there's anybody here that's having trouble quitting smoking, just go talk to your pastor and say, can I have 1 minute at your pulpit? And then on Sunday morning, step up and say, I stand here before God and everyone, and I'll never smoke another cigarette again as long as I live. May the Lord strike me dead and send me to hell if I lie. That'll work. The problem is you have to make the commitment. So I thank WHO for helping me make that commitment. And those other folks that stepped in on that, there's somebody in the room that helped out with that lawsuit. And I got to pay for a fair amount of that out of my kids' inheritance. And I tell them, sorry boys, but there wasn't going to be a lot anyway, and this way you get to inherit liberty instead of money. And here we are, fast forward to 2012. Deja vu all over again, as you notice that. And so I'm watching this bill with the president disregarding the law and contempt for the Constitution, utter arrogance in the executive branch. And then I see I'm queued up to do Mike Huckabee's radio program and his national program. And I'm not paying attention to what the subject matter is that he wants to talk about. But about 30 minutes before we went on the air, the president completed his press conference in the Rose Garden when he said, we are not going to enforce a law against these groups of people, and we're going to grant this DREAM Act because Congress should have done it, and they didn't. Congress has voted it down in the 109th, 10th, 11th, and 12th Congress. 8 years Congress has said no, and the president, with utter stubbornness and arrogance, decided he could pass a law by executive edict. Well, I hadn't seen the executive order. Actually, it turned into a memorandum by Justice Nana Napolitano. I hadn't seen it, but I knew what was in it because I heard the news reports from the president's speech. And so, here we go again. Mike Huckabee said on the radio program, what are you going to do about it, Congressman? Suing the president. Suing the president because he can't violate the Constitution. He can't legislate by executive edict. And if we don't guard our authority that's granted us in the Constitution, nobody else is going to. So I can tell you today that last Tuesday, and I can't name names at this point of the attorneys, we had a power meeting in Washington. The very best constitutional lawyers and brains that one could gather together on the conservative side either sat at the table or were linked by phone to conference. And we talked that case through. There are about 4 components to litigate, maybe actually 5. And throughout all of that, once we get past the standings question, every one of them agrees that if we can get the case heard on its merits, it's very, very likely that we will succeed in court and get a court to provide an injunction to block that executive edict of President Obama's. That's what's so it's not a halfway effort, it's a whole way effort. We're all in on this, and it's a little side thing going on with the campaign that we have. And so Christy Vilsack announced that she was going to be a candidate to run for Congress. And there are a lot of things that one might say about that, but what you've seen over the last year is, I think she moved to Ames. I think she's active here in the community. I guess I don't know that. She has said that she would raise over $3 million. She's pretty much on schedule to get that done. There are 8 different PACs that have announced that they're lined up against me. 3 of them are super PACs. We've never had a super PAC election like this before. This will be the most expensive congressional race in the history of Iowa. All of her money will be spent attacking me. She has no positive agenda to run. It'll all be spent attacking me. I said that more than a year ago. I'm still right. I'd like her to prove me wrong, but I don't think that's going to be the case. And I don't yet know what issues it is that matter to her. But I put out a challenge for debates March 16th of this year. And I offered 6 dates that worked within, when I wasn't voting in Washington, 6 towns, 6 dates, 6 towns, 6 debates. And that's 18 components altogether. And I thought she might accept 1 or 2 or 18 of those. I was hoping to be 18. And instead, she didn't accept any of them. And now, this is July. And we think there's going to be a day on WHO Radio about September 6th. I'll be there. We think there might be one in Mason City. If we have one, I'll be there. The rest of this has been scrambled a little bit in the last couple of days. So here's what I want you to know is that I think we ought to do Lincoln-Douglas format. You don't have to do a lot of planning to do that. You just need a place where you can set 2 chairs. I said this on WHO television in an interview with Dave Price earlier today. I'll debate her anywhere, anytime, any place where you can set 2 chairs. We don't need moderators. We don't need rules. Let's just have that conversation so we can find out what's in my head and what's in hers. Yeah. And that, I think, will get us to the So, you know, some wonder where she might be, but I will tell you, Christy Vilsack is for Obamacare. She has said so in this way. She's running for Congress to help Barack Obama get elected, and she's running to support his agenda. Can anybody imagine that his agenda would not be Obamacare? Of course not. She's running to support Obamacare, and now she said on Iowa Press that it might be the mandate, it might not be the mandate. Later on, some weeks later, then she said, that she didn't like the mandate because she didn't like people to tell her what to do. Well, if she's opposed to the mandate before Obamacare, then she's against the pre-existing conditions language, because without the mandate, that doesn't work. Nobody's challenging her on that. Somebody needs to. I'll do that in debates if we can get that done. But from my standpoint, I want to thank all of our contributors, all of our donors, everybody that's working, everybody that's volunteered, everybody that will volunteer. And I want to ask you to re-engage. We're in a good place. We had an outstanding fundraising effort in the last quarter. We caught up with her and passed her in that regard. Thanks to all of you for that. And we also were over a number of resources significantly better than she is. Now, I'm not at any comfort level here, because when those super PACs light up, they're going to come with things like we have never seen. And I've told many of you before, I've been saying this for a year, in this campaign from the Vilsacks, I will learn things about you that I don't yet know. That's the measure. That's the measure of what we're up against. And so, but we're going to work this thing. We've got the grassroots part of this going. It feels good. We do have a lot of signs up out, and we're going to get a lot more signs up. And you know where I stand. I'm for the full 100% repeal of Obamacare. And so is Mitt Romney. And he's repeated it so many times. I don't know that we could have had a presidential candidate with more commitment on the repeal of Obamacare, the 100% repeal of Obamacare. I'm encouraged by that, but I do say, and consistent with Simon's statement here, that first you have to repeal Obamacare before you have anything to replace. And I don't want those two arguments to be conflated. We've got to get this argument completely won, that it's all got to come out by the roots, that Obamacare is a malignant tumor that's metastasizing, and it feeds on American liberty. It's unconstitutional. It's an unconstitutional takings. It's a government takeover of your skin and everything inside it. And with regard to that 10% tax on the tanning salon, it's a 10% tax on the outside on top of it to add insult to injury. And it's got to go. And so there's that piece. And the balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. I cannot reiterate how important that is to all of us. I watched the psychology of the members of Congress. I can tell you, in the House and in the Senate today, the will to balance the budget does not exist. It's not strong enough to do what must be done, to have the discipline to get our spending down under what's coming in. It's not there. The House Republicans take a step towards that if they had Republican majorities in the Senate that were pushing that. That bill doesn't get it. We've got to have a constitutional amendment. The only way we get a constitutional amendment out of the House and the Senate is for Mitt Romney. And I'm asking him to do this. I call for a mandate from the American people to use the bully pulpit of the presidency of the United States to push that balanced budget through the Congress, send it out to the states for ratification. If we do that, we can save this country from the abyss of bankruptcy. If we fail, then we have that's got to happen. And, I did have a little fun last week in the market with the Farm Bill. I'll just say one thing. There were a number. We started at 10 on Wednesday morning. We finished at 1 o'clock on Thursday morning. And we went 33%. And so it wore some people down, but it gave me an opportunity to work the members, Democrats and Republicans. And I've been watching what's going on around the country in places like California, Ohio, Florida, Arizona, regulating the means of production of agriculture coming into their states. I don't know how this is. They were actually had blocked Iowa ethanol from going into California because they were regulating the means of production on the circular farming. Well, they lost in court on that eventually, but California passed enough to California that were not raised in an approved-size cage. There was going to be free range, you know. And Ohio was going along with that. Florida and Arizona have passed bans on gestation crates for pork production. So I'm watching this. I know when it's the U.S., the Humane Society of the United States. He is not your local animal shelter guy. He is a guy with cufflinks in Washington with a $200 million budget. Simon's had him in the studio. You look at him in the eye, you get to know a little bit about him. He does not care about the truth. He has an agenda. That agenda is to take meat and animal products off of your plate everywhere in America, incrementally, a piece at a time. So I have done battle with him, and I can give you a long list of that. I realized about a year ago that the states were violating the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, that enumerated power, and by regulating the means of production of our ag products. How would California know if an egg that arrived at the border was from a free-range hen if they just looked at the egg? So I don't have a problem with them specifying what a product has to be when it arrives. I do have a problem with them specifying how you produce that product. That's regulation of interstate commerce by the states. So I written a bill that I turned into an amendment late on Wednesday night that prohibits the states and their political subdivisions from regulating the means of production of commonly traded ag products. And in doing so, I got the amendment on, and in doing so, it blocks all of the state efforts. Any constitutional amendment of the state, any statute, any ordinance from any political subdivision right on down to the city, they are banned from regulating that means of production. We hold that together. We have shut down that effort that's to try to take meat off of our plates. And Wayne Pacelli had a bad day at the head of HSUS. And he did. And so I want to emphasize, I think, that we should be looking for simple solutions to complex problems. You know, you can make it very complicated, and you can take the arguments down to the minutiae, and you can vary things by dealing with minutiae. But in the end, if we just take ourselves back to the Constitution, free enterprise, the rule of law, the basis of our free society, the Western civilization, Western Christendom, as Winston Churchill declared it to be, always boil it back down to the fundamentals instead of overcomplicating it. You can find some truth and justice in the American way in these things. That Protect Interstate Commerce Act is one of those, a simple solution to a complex problem. And so I just think of the Sandberg brothers in Chiron. I made a little trip up to Goodell here a couple days ago. I spent my grade school years there in that little town of probably a couple hundred people now. I went back to where our place was, and I wouldn't even send a picture of it, but I leaned against one of the trees that I had planted. It is an ash tree about this big now. And a fellow that used to run the blacksmith shop there, his name was the Sandberg Blacksmith Shop. And in Chiron, my little town, the people that do the repair work there are the Sandberg brothers. And behind their counter, they have a sign. And it says, complicated, technical, difficult projects are our specialty. Simple projects are beyond our comprehension. Well, I just say, let us keep it simple. It's beyond their comprehension, not ours. Let's bring this back to the Constitution and free enterprise and the strength of our family, God-given liberty, and the protection of life, and the protection of marriage. We believe in all of these things, and we have something that's worth fighting for. This is a destiny election, as David Owens said. This is not just the most important election of your life. This is a destiny election. And I challenge all of you, rise up to this. Let's take them on. Let's look back at this time in history and understand this was the day, this was the time in history that our state, our county, our country pulled together to throw back the people on the left and restore God-given American liberty and constitutional values. Thank you very much.